Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security.
Hello, this is John Bicknell, and before we start this week's discussion, I want to remind listeners about a virtual panel event that is next week, Thursday, October 29th at 1200 Eastern Time, 1100 Central Time, co-sponsored by the Information Professionals Association and the Alamo chapter of AFCEA, entitled Combating Disinformation in a Competitive Information Environment. The panel is sure to be a very interesting and important discussion, including panelists Lieutenant General Ed Carden, Mr. Rob Busian, Bob Pearson, Dr. Brian Price, and Joe Kelly, and the panel will be moderated by IPA's very own Mr. Austin Branch. You can find out more information at the Information Professionals Association website, information-professionals.org/events, where you can find out more information about registering for this virtual panel. And now on to today's discussion. My guest is Dr. Jacob Udo-Udo Jacob, who is visiting international scholar in the International Studies program at Dickinson College. Dr. Jacob earned his PhD in Communications Studies with a focus on strategic communications from the University of Leeds in the UK. Dr. Jacob has worked with the United Nations on the revision of the Public Information and Strategic Communications module of the Integrated Disarmament, Demobilization and Reintegration standards during peace operations. He also leads Dickinson College's Bridge program, which provides educational opportunities to young people from regions of the world experiencing conflict and natural disasters, and for whom higher education would otherwise be impossible. Dr. Jacob co-leads the development of a methodological and ethical guide for violent extremism research at the Resolve Network, a research program hosted at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Dr. Jacob, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you so much, John, for having me.
So you have a fascinating background. I'm hoping that you can give our audience a little bit more of a tour of your life and experience, and especially how it led you into your life's work around strategic communications.
Well, I've always been, for some reason, interested in war, and that I think is connected to my early upbringing. My parents actually met at a refugee or displacement people's camp in Nigeria in the late 1960s during the Nigeria-Biafra Civil War. And my mom was just barely 15 years old, and her education had been disrupted, and she was there at the refugee camp and obviously struggling like everybody else there. And somehow they got married, and a few years later they had me. So growing up as a kid in Calabar, in the southeastern part of Nigeria, I never really had the kind of sort of bedtime stories that kids have. It was usually stories of war and the kind of impact that the Nigeria-Biafra war had on my parents. So growing up, there were lots and lots of stories about the war and how they fled from where they were to the refugee camp and everything else. So I think growing up, I've always been interested on the impact of wars on societies and on individuals. And when I had the opportunity to study for a PhD, I was particularly interested in how wars are, the kind of impacts that wars have on societies, and the communication tools that can be used to inform people about the nature of conflict, and also the communication tools that can be used to persuade fighters to lay down their arms and embrace peace. So I think it's really I've got to go back to my childhood and upbringing to really map my interest in what I'm doing right now.
Okay, well, thank you for that additional background. So let's get into your strategic communications and the practical learnings, theoretical learnings around strategic communications, and what are the what is the history around strategic communications, and what has been tried, what works and what doesn't work? Maybe you can just kind of give a little 101 around strategic communications, especially as it relates to countering violent extremism.
Well, you think about, first of all, with countering violent extremism, what comes to mind within the purview of strategic communications is counter-narratives. And counter-narratives actually have their roots in the work of Harold Laswell in the early 20th century. Harold Laswell's hypothetical strange effect model of communication essentially sees communication, or strategic communications as we call it today, as basically who says what to whom, through what channel, and with what effect. So Laswell's work, 1927 work, Propaganda in the Great War, focused on the propaganda techniques that were deployed during the First World War.
Okay.
And essentially his work is somehow focused on the impact of messages on audiences, and the nature of the channel that is used, and of course also the nature of the messenger or the source of that message, and how all these combine to affect the receiver or the audience. But over the years, I have to say that more and more communication scholars have somehow questioned the theoretical structure of Harold Laswell's communication model, because impact is not just tied to the message, but impact is tied increasingly so to the audience itself.
Okay.
So if we're thinking about strategic communications within the context of countering violent extremism today, there is that increasing awareness that that rather than focusing only on the message or the counter narratives, which I have to say has been the focus over many years, the focus has shifted, and rightly so, towards the audience, the ways that audiences make meaning of messages, and the modalities that define the way audiences interpret the messages that they receive. So the focus essentially has shifted from counter narratives per se, or messaging, if you like, to the networks within which audiences are located, and the society that they are located, and in thinking about the society, you also think about the norms that
Hmm.
inform acceptable forms of behaviors.
I see. So you've done a significant amount of work with the UN, globally, to, in DDR missions, or disarmament,
Indeed.
demobilization, and reintegration missions. Do you have any specific examples of, the kinds of things that have been tried but were less effective, and then, doing communications which were more effective along the lines of what you were just describing, focusing on
Indeed.
the network and how the audience receives the message, compared to focusing on the message itself, which you say tends to be less effective?
Indeed, the UN's DDR program has been in existence for almost 30 years, and
Yeah.
over the past 30 years, it's really been a very mechanical or procedural program, where there is the disarmament, there's the demobilization, and there's the reintegration process. But more recently, there's been that consciousness that we need to look at DDR more as a process, not just as a program. A process in the sense that it interoperates with the different the different stations, if you like, of the broader war to peace transition. So, in any society, then, that is embroiled in conflict, that is so bad that there is need for UN intervention or an international intervention, what becomes clear is that the society has been damaged in many ways, not just by the conflict, but also by notions of the other, what individuals think about other individuals. In the case of Rwanda, for example,
Hmm.
the genocide in Rwanda in the early 1990s, what led to the genocide really was years and years of dehumanization, where one ethnic group embarked on a relentless campaign of dehumanizing the other, and by the time the conflict had escalated to an actual ethnic pogrom, notions of the other had gotten so bad that people did not necessarily see themselves as human, if you like, but as Hutu, essentially, in that particular context, and the other as Tutsi. So when you look more broadly at most of the conflicts that the UN has intervened in since since the end of the Cold War, most of the conflicts are either conflicts that are ethnic in nature,
Hmm.
relative, or extremist in nature. So my work with the UN in the past recent months actually has focused on the revision of the public information and strategic communications module of the integrated DDR standards, which is a set of standards that's being developed to reassess the way the United Nations conduct its DDR programs within peace operations. One interesting example I would like to reference is the example
Yeah,
of
yeah.
the Democratic Republic of Congo. I did quite some extensive research in the DRC at the height of the DRC conflict between 2006 and 2009. And what I found quite fascinating, really, is that as at that time, the United Nations had a very interesting radio program on its radio station called Radio Copy. The radio station is called Radio Copy, but the
What,
program,
what was that called again? Radio
Radio
what?
Okapi, Okapi,
Okay.
OKAPI. Yes, Radio
Okay.
Okapi. Radio Copy at that time, as a matter of fact, was run by Hirondelle Foundation. Hirondelle Foundation is a Swiss-based non-governmental organization, and their intermediate development. So it was quite an interesting partnership between the UN mission in the DRC and Hirondelle Foundation. And but the mission had a very interesting radio program called Gutahuka. Gutahuka is a Kenya-Rwandan word. It means go back home. And that program was targeted at Rwandan Hutus who were mainly members of the FDLR, one of the at that time, the predominant rebel group at that time. So the intention of that program was to convince individual fighters of the FDLR to lay down their weapons, basically to defect and join the DDR program and get processed and transitioned into civilian life and repatriated to Rwanda, because most of them were ethnic Hutus from Rwanda. So my study of that program and the impact it had on audiences showed that the program was successful to an extent. However, it had unintended consequences on the broader society, because members of the society in Eastern DRC, mainly South Kivu and North Kivu, in Eastern DRC, who were not members of the FDLR, somehow had, because of that program, negative opinions of every Hutu, because they then thought that that Hutus were responsible for the war that was going on there in the DRC at that time. That every sort of everything that was going wrong with the DRC or with the conflict at that time was because of the members of the FDLR, not just members of the FDLR, but Hutus, because there was this epistemic association between members of the FDLR and Hutus, essentially because Hutus were essentially members of the FDLR, whereas the Hutus that were just ordinary people living in those communities, civilians, that men, women, children, that were just they're living their lives like everybody else. So whereas this program was created to convince fighters of the FDLR to disarm, it contributed to creating ethnic tensions in the society. And I looked at another program that was broadcast at that time on radio, the same Radio Copy, but it was produced by Hirondelle Foundation. This program was not produced by MONUC, that's the UN mission there in the DRC, but it was produced by Hirondelle Foundation. That program was called Dialogue contre Congolais, or Dialogue between Congolese, and it was an audience participation program. So sort of a phone-in program, and
interesting, yeah.
So certain members of the society were invited from various facets or of the society, various communities of the society, ethnic, religious, political, economic segments of the society, to participate in this program on studio. Then people were given opportunity to call in from their homes and businesses and so on and ask questions. But the fascinating aspect of this program was that it focused on issues of democracy, issues of tolerance, issues of it focused more broadly on conflict analysis, on this situation there in that country that at that time that militated against the return of peace and democracy. And it showed that this program showed that most of the problem was not necessarily with the FDLR. The problem was more about collapsed institutions, the corruption of the political elites, and a war economy that had been created around the Eastern DRC. And to an extent, that program privileged institutions as the system that can enable the emergence of peace and democracy, rather than just one set of one armed group, right, being responsible for violence. My conclusion, essentially, from my studies in the DRC is that interventions of that nature should focus more on the society. What can bring people together? What can open up a space, a multidimensional space, if you like, for dialogue, for different communities of thoughts to come together and debate about the common good. What can help to build democratic cultures in society, particularly in societies where those cultures are not present, and how institutions can be rebuilt from the ground floor up, rather than just focusing on one particular problem.
I see. I see.
Or group.
Going back about 5 minutes ago in the discussion, you mentioned that DDR and perhaps strategic messaging in general is a process, and there's a flow of events that happen and attitude changes. Is thinking about it as a process, is that a relatively new way of examining the problem, or is this something that has been known for a while? Or is this something that has typically been put into practice, this notion of a process and looking at it that way? Or is this something that you're having to try to convince people to think of it that way?
If you think about the Cold War, the Cold War wasn't fought with messages per se. If you think about the information aspect of the Cold War, it was more of a process, and not just messaging. Of course, there was Radio Free Europe and various other informational tools that were deployed at the time. But it was more of a long-term engagement that involved various programs. It involved mainstream media. It involved popular culture. It involved, as at that time, the U.S. had the U.S. Information Agency, and its role really was to undertake a more long-term process of communication that engaged with people and with societies, and showed a different form of culture that was different from what people were used to behind the Iron Curtain. But more recently, what you tend to see is a focus just on counter narratives. So counter narratives, by its very essence, seems to focus on specific messages that are created to counter perhaps an ideology, or perhaps a particular message, or to tell us that this person is bad and that person is bad, so don't listen to them. And very short-term in nature. So it's not an entirely new phenomenon, no, but it's somehow it's been forgotten, I have to say.
Right, and your point is that direct counter messaging or counter narrative, the focusing on the message, it's not that it's unimportant, but it may not be the most important concept in a strategic communications project.
Indeed. Messages, of course, do have their place in any campaign whatsoever. But then the meaning is not necessarily in any message, whatever these messages are, whether these are ancient cave paintings or Egyptian hieroglyphics, whatever these are.
Yeah.
Meanings are never in the text.
Yeah, no, that really makes the point quite vividly. The cave paintings, especially.
Indeed. So, yeah.
I want to switch gears slightly. So, not mentioned in the bio that I read at the top, you are also an adjunct professor at the Army War College, and you teach a couple of courses, but one in particular, media in war and peace. Could you tell us? I mean, we have a sizable military audience for this podcast. I'm hoping that you can tell us a little bit more about that course that you teach and the officers' response or engagement in the course, and just tell us a little bit about that interaction there at the Army War College.
Yeah, what I tend to see the past couple of years or so that I've taught the course at the U.S. officers that come into this course are at the very critical intersection of their careers, and in most cases awaiting their next their next assignment, or just about to take their next assignment. So when they come into that class, they want to know the evidence base that they can draw upon to do their work when they move on to their new assignments. So the course essentially looks at the media very broadly, not just mainstream media as we know it, but also social media and the broad architecture of communications, and what contributions communications can really make to our understanding of the reasons societies mobilize for war, and how societies can be convinced to take a different path and pursue peace. So one of the core elements of that course is a trip typically to the United Nations. We normally have a study visits to the UN's DDR section. That ties it again to my consultative work with the UN, and we are usually particularly interested in the Disarmament, Demobilization and Reintegration program, because that is the DDR program or process is political in nature, political in the sense that it involves persuading fighters to disarm and join a process, and also persuading the society or convincing, if you like, the society to accept fighters back into their communities, or people that were associated with armed groups, and that could also include children and women working in various roles, sometimes as sex slaves, sometimes as cooks. So and when we look at specific case studies, whether these case studies are in Mali or whether they're in the DRC or any other country or Colombia, what we look out for really is the lessons that can be drawn from excuse me, from such cases, and how those lessons tie up with theory. In the last class, we specifically looked at the Russian malign influence operations and asked ourselves, how did this happen? Can this be explained theoretically?
Well, that's fascinating stuff. I'm sure the officers who have engaged with you are getting all kinds of benefit that they can take with them into their remainder of their military careers. I want to ask you about one other item at Dickinson College. You lead a program known as the Bridge program, which sounds like it is a fantastic way of helping some disadvantaged folks. Could you tell us a little bit more about your involvement with the Bridge program?
Yes, indeed. The Bridge program provides, I think it's in college, provides an educational opportunity for people that normally would not have access to higher education because of their status as refugees. Actually, around the world, it's just 1% of refugees that are qualified that actually have access to higher education. And what we do at Dickinson is to provide a bridge, not just an educational bridge really here, but also a bridge and experience. So experience between a past that is of conflict and violence, and an experience that is more stable and structured in nature. So the program, we work with these students to get them prepared to take the GED examination and obtain the minimum requirements that is needed for them to access higher education in the US. And in addition to that, we'll provide psychosocial support. We've got 4 students that were that were captured by Boko Haram at the height of the Boko Haram insurgency, but luckily they were able to escape and they came to the US. So that is essentially what the Bridge program is about, providing that educational opportunity to refugees that would not normally have such an opportunity, and giving them basically another shot at higher education. My experience and my learning really from there is that education is very powerful. And for these students, it's pretty much the only license really that they have to the future that they desire.
Yeah, that sounds like it's a probably a very vivid intersection for you, both personally and professionally, that program.
Absolutely.
I like to ask all of our guests if they could recommend, a book that is related to everything that we've been talking about, so something they may not already know about, but that they can go and check out to learn more about strategic communications and the kinds of things that we've been discussing here.
I particularly like Robert Cialdini's books, and his most recent book, Presuition: A Revolutionary Way to Influence and Persuade, is a fascinating book because he talks about how we are prepared for persuasion. So the communication of persuasion, or the message that persuades, is important, but not as important as the preparation for that. So how can societies, individuals, and communities be prepared to, or be framed, if you like, to be in the sort of social, cultural, or political position to receive a particular message? Because look, no matter how beautiful a message is crafted, no matter how great it is, I mean, if it is met with a closed door or shut ears, that message will fall flat on its back, and that is what Robert Cialdini tries to bring forward in his book Persuasion. And I think, although his books generally meant for consumers and marketers of products, I think they are some some specific lessons that can emerge from there, particularly for people working within the space of influence operations and information operations generally.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for that. We will put a link to that in the show notes. And with that, Dr. Jacob, thank you so much for being on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you so much, John, for having me. Thank you.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.